Tonight on Bridge City News, a former Liberal MP who is now with GasBuddy.com says we in Lethbridge are paying way too much at the pumps. Hear what Dan McTagg has to say about gas prices in our region. Environment Minister Shanna Phillips expressed her concerns in Ottawa recently about Bill C-69. We have the details. And a First Nations band in northern Alberta receives over $100 million and over 200 hectares of land. We will explain why. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is traveling across the country telling us about his new carbon tax plan and how it will benefit us. Dan McTagg is a former Liberal MP and he's now with GasBuddy.com. Dan joins me now via Skype from Ontario. Dan, a lot of Canadians are pretty upset with Mr. Trudeau's carbon tax plan.
And they should be. It's really a carbon tax gouge. And I think one has to put these things in perspective. We're not going to change anything by imposing a tax and then redistributing that, and worse, trying to come up with what amounts to rather creative accounting in terms of commentary that you're going to take in less, but you're going to give out more. That just doesn't make sense. And I know that there are some people out there willing to put their names to it, but I wouldn't, money does not grow off trees. And I think most people understand that as a basis. Look, if we want to do something, we're going to have industry and encourage industry to make those changes. And right here in Alberta, we're doing a lot of that. The level of emissions are dropping dramatically. There's incentives to do that. The public's demand, but don't force it on them.
Let's talk about the price of the pumps right now. We're paying $1.26 a litre here in Lethbridge. In Medicine Hat, it's about $1.12. Sherwood Park, just outside of Edmonton, is $1.06. But at $1.06 a litre, those stations are actually losing money.
Hal, if you're in Lethbridge right now, you're making as a gas station retailer about 15 cents a litre. That's a really good margin. If you're in Medicine Hat, you're losing your shirt because you're buying your gasoline or you're selling your gasoline pretty much at the price at which you're buying it. If you go up to Edmonton, Sherwood Park and places like that, you're looking at $1.06. Well, it's costing most gas stations about $1.08 to buy their fuel. Unless you're able to sell a lot of beef jerky, a lot of potato chips at your gas station, in those markets, you're losing your shirt. But of course, consumers are winning, but they're only winning on the last 11 or 10 cents a litre, which is the retail margin. So this is really a shout out to gas stations in Lethbridge. Guys, come on, you're buying your gasoline for $1.11. Try not to take advantage of folks by selling it at $1.26. I think $1.23, $1.24 at the top end would be more than reasonable. And that's really the margins you see in big cities where the cost of real estate is extraordinarily expensive.
Former Liberal MP and now with GasBuddy.com, Dan McTagg, thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Hal.
Alberta's Environment Minister Shanna Phillips was in Ottawa yesterday, urging senators not to pass Bill C-69 in its current form since it could hurt Alberta's energy sector. After meeting with close to 50 senators, Phillips says the bill shouldn't pass without changes being made. The bill would create a new impact assessment agency and would replace the National Energy Board and the Canadian Energy Regulator. Phillips says more clarity is still needed on the bill.
Bill C-69 cannot pass in its current form. It needs more clarity. I take the issues of engaging Indigenous peoples, whether it's at the level of the provincial crown or the federal crown, very, very seriously. I take issues related to protecting our environment, making sure we're taking action on climate change very seriously, which is why we have the climate leadership plan in place in Alberta that we do. I also, as a minister in a government that has just faced one of the most significant recessions in a generation, understand that large projects and resource development is going to power our economy for years to come, and we need that certainty in order to put Canadians and Albertans to work.
Many critics of the current bill say it would create delays in approving major energy projects. The federal government has to set aside close to $75 million to pay for the transition. Did Canada get trumped in the new trade deal with the United States and Mexico? That was the topic of discussion at SACPA today. University of Lethbridge political science professor Chris Kakucha talked about the deal, appearing for his second time at SACPA after talking about NAFTA negotiations in April. The deal, according to the professor, doesn't have many glaring differences from NAFTA. The trade deal did, however, help Canada avoid a potential tariff on automobiles.
Canada has agreed to open up I think roughly 3.6% of its dairy market to the United States, and that'll be a combination of tariffs and quotas. How they do that will be worked out. So that will present some challenges for Canadian dairy producers, probably not to the level that they're saying, but it will present some challenges. But other than that, it's really just trying to standardize the tariff levels that are in other areas. It didn't do anything to address steel and aluminum yet. That's still ongoing. It did help us avoid the 25% tariff on automobiles that was being threatened.
Kakucha also said regardless of the agreement the two countries reached, NAFTA was a deal that needed modernizing. The Alberta government recently announced a $4.5 million increase to support victims of crime. Lethbridge will receive $300,000, which doubles their revenue. Funds will go towards domestic violence survivors, help for victims in court, and restorative justice initiatives. Outreach services for Indigenous victims will also receive financial help. Darcy James has been working with victim services for over 9 years. As the program manager, she relies heavily on the work of support workers.
We support the victims from the beginning to the middle and to the very end and beyond. So there's a lot of stuff, and in the news release they talked about restorative justice. Well, victim services is now getting part of those programs to support victims if they choose to go through the restorative justice process.
Crisis support workers in Lethbridge have spent 22,000 hours a year working with victims in need. Lethbridge police have charged a 38-year-old woman in connection with an assault on Wednesday afternoon. Police allege that Stacey Whiteman attacked a 70-year-old man along 70th Street South after accusing him of having her money. She whacked him with her purse, causing injuries to his face that needed multiple stitches to close. The woman then left the area and entered a nearby bank where she began threatening staff. It was there that she was arrested. Stacey Lee Whiteman's charges include assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm. While we've been enjoying unusually warm and dry temperatures, there's a price to be paid for that. Lethbridge County has issued a fire advisory thanks to the dry and windy conditions. Alberta Agriculture and Forestry says there's a very high risk of fire right now. Those who are still harvesting are asked to take extra precaution to prevent ignition in the fields. The county is asking residents in the county to postpone any burning activities until the fire advisory has been lifted. If conditions persist, the county may impose an outright fire ban. For updates, be sure to visit the Alberta Fire Ban's website at albertafirebans.ca. The University of Lethbridge is hosting a 3-day Fine Arts and Technology Conference. The event will bring in hundreds of faculty members and students from schools across Western Canada. It is the 3rd annual Crossing Boundaries Conference. This year, the focus will be on technology.
This year it's a little different because we have crossed with IAST, which is a network that celebrates and explores interactive art, science, and technology. So this year we have various visiting artists from all over Western Canada discussing topics about science and interactive art, and there's all kinds of stuff going on this week in the symposium.
The conference continues tomorrow with various guest speakers and opportunities to attend workshops and lectures. The Homes for Heroes Foundation is set to speak before Calgary City Council on November the 12th. The group is hoping to receive the go-ahead to begin construction on Calgary's first tiny home community for war veterans.
What we've done with the Homes for Heroes Foundation is develop a project that meets the needs of our homeless vets. So the goal here is to build micro home, tiny home communities set up in a barrack style with a full resource center as part of the project. And that resource center would house a full-time counselor. You know, post-traumatic stress is a huge factor of our veterans transitioning back to civilian life. So what you see is with post-traumatic stress is it starts to creep in that 5, 6, 7 years after they leave. So a lot of times people think of veterans being in their 90s and the World War II vets, but we're talking about young men and women that are in their 20s or 30s that have been into theater in Afghanistan, are coming back and are struggling.
Howard says they hope to develop 2 tiny home communities for war veterans in every major city in the country. Alberta, Ottawa, and the Lubicon Lake Band announced a land claim deal after failed negotiations, broken promises, and standoffs. The settlement includes $113 million and a swath of land. Alberta Premier Rachel Notley says the deal sets aside 246 square kilometers of land in Little Buffalo of northern Alberta. The feds will also add $95 million in compensation, while Alberta will be kicking in with $18 million. The money will go towards roads, housing, and utility services for the 682 residents who have long struggled with poverty. Chief Billy Joe Lubicon says the deal provides renewed hope for the band, but came after his people lived in squalor as billions of dollars from oil, gas, and timber was extracted from their land. Alberta Premier Rachel Notley says her government will soon enact legislation to ensure public sector workers will have joint governance of their pension plans. Notley told the United Nurses of Alberta that the bill would come after the legislature resumes on Monday. She says employees deserve an equal say in future decisions about the plans that cover around 300,000 Albertans. A man convicted of killing a Calgary woman has filed an appeal of his first-degree murder conviction. A jury found Curtis Healy guilty last month, and he received 25 years in prison with no chance of parole. The court heard that he raped and killed Dawn Baptiste in 2015 after the mother of four told him to leave her alone after getting off a transit train. The notice of appeal says the judge made legal mistakes. It contends the judge wrongly allowed some statements that Healy made about the case as evidence. Nurses in Saskatchewan can now prescribe the drug known as the abortion pill. The pill, also known as RU486, is an anti-hormonal medication that terminates an early pregnancy. The Nurses Association in Saskatchewan says it is now within the scope of practice for a registered nurse to prescribe the pill. Previously in Saskatchewan, the pill could only be prescribed by a physician. New York City's mayor is hailing the quick work of a security guard who alerted authorities to a suspicious device at Robert De Niro's Manhattan office.
Want to emphasize and thank everybody at the NYPD who's doing an outstanding job. The device was removed successfully. Thank God there were no injuries. The really quick-witted work of a security guard there at that facility in Tribeca is to thanks for the fact that nothing happened and no harm was done to anyone. But that device, very similar to the other devices that have been located in the last 48 hours. And it all appears to be from the same sender. That investigation is ongoing.
Former CIA Director John Brennan spoke about the pipe bombs that were sent to Democratic politicians and the news network CNN. The envelope received by CNN was actually addressed to Brennan.
We cannot have the civil discourse that we need about the future direction of our country and policies without having individuals, I think very disturbed individuals, resorting to attempted acts of violence.
And I just want to tell you that in these times, we have to unify. We have to come together and send one very clear, strong, unmistakable message that acts or threats of political violence of any kind have no place in the United States of America.
Well, I'm tempted to say that was said by Donald who? Well, I think it's very important for an individual who is in the Oval Office today to say exactly that we need to come together as a country.
Residents of the northern Mariana Islands face months without electricity or running water after a nasty storm slammed into their region. Super Typhoon U2 crossed the U.S. territory earlier today, packing winds of 180 miles an hour, which is 290 kilometers an hour. Now, do you believe in miracles such as healing? How about raising people from the dead? It is apparently something that happens quite frequently in various countries in Africa.
Americans are going to say, because we're pretty skeptical, how do you know they're really dead since there was no doctor there, since this is way out in the bush where there weren't any hospitals close by or even any type of medical facilities? How do you know they're dead? And he said, well, there's no pulse. We can't feel any breath. Their eyes glaze over and then they get cold and then they get stiff. And I said, Johnny, I think even for skeptical Americans, we would believe that that's dead.
Catch my entire interview with Dr. Randy Clark, the founder of Global Awakening, coming up in the second half of our show. It was on this date that the Cuban Missile Crisis fuels a Cold War clash at the UN. The charge of the Light Brigade battle takes place, and golfer Payne Stewart is killed in a plane crash. This is Today in History for October the 25th.
October 25th, 1962. In New York, the Cuban Missile Crisis takes center stage at the United Nations Security Council. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson presents photographic evidence of Soviet missile bases in Cuba. Stevenson challenges Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin in this memorable Cold War exchange.
You're in the court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
Continue your statement, please. You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
1971. China's seat at the United Nations changes hands. The UN General Assembly votes to admit communist mainland China and expel Taiwan. 1983. An American-led force invades Grenada to oust a leftist government allied with Cuba and the Soviet Union. President Ronald Reagan calls the action necessary to protect U.S. citizens on the Caribbean island nation. 1854. The battle that inspires the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade happens during the Crimean War. An English brigade of more than 600 men, facing hopeless odds, charges Russia's army during the Battle of Balaclava and suffers heavy losses. 1400. Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales, one of English literature's greatest works, dies in London. And 1999, golfer Payne Stewart and 5 others are killed when their Learjet crashes in South Dakota after flying uncontrolled for 4 hours. Stewart was 42 years old. Today in History, October 25th, Carlotta Bradley, The Associated Press.
We're pleased to welcome our news video journalist to the BCN team. It's Ainsley O'Reilly. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah, you bet. So where are you from originally? Tell our viewers a little bit about Ainsley O'Reilly.
I'm originally from Kitchener, Ontario, made the move to Toronto, Ontario for 3 years, and now I'm in Lethbridge. When I was in Toronto, though, I spent some time with TSN, I spent some time with Sirius XM, but I'm super eager to start here with Bridge City News.
Now, you're a big sports fan as well, right?
Yes, and I'm excited because there's a lot of CFL going on. I know a little bit more north in Calgary and a little bit more north in Edmonton as well, but I'm excited to hit some of those games up.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, tell us about some of your other passions and some of the stories you're looking forward to covering here in southwestern Alberta.
I'm a connector. I love talking to people, meeting with members of the community. Anybody is welcome to message me on social media or on Facebook, even if they just want to chat. And that's what I love about Lethbridge so far and about the Bridge City News team is that we cover stories that really speak to the silent majority.
Absolutely. Giving the silent majority voices what it's all about. Welcome to the team, Ainsley.
Thank you so much.
Lots of sunshine and mild again today. The warm temperatures will stick around a little while longer. I'll have a complete look at the weather picture momentarily. Sunshine and warm again today in the Windy City. Partly cloudy tonight with a low near 5. Tomorrow, more clouds rolling in with a high near 16. Saturday, mainly sunny with a high near 13 degrees. Sunday, a mixture of sun and cloud and the temperature dropping down to 11. Monday, a slight chance of showers and a high near 9. Tuesday, mainly cloudy with the mercury dropping down to 8. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 11 degrees and an average low of -2. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1990 at 24 degrees, and the record low was a chilly -21 in 1939. Sunrise was at 8:08, sunset at 6:22. Let's have a look at how tomorrow's shaping up across the country. Rain is expected in Vancouver with a high near 15. A good chance of showers as well in Victoria with a high near 17. Calgary will be partly cloudy and a high near 14. Edmonton will be mainly sunny and 15. Regina will have lots of sunshine and 12. A few clouds and 11 is on tap for Saskatoon. Winnipeg will have rain and 10 degrees. Over in the central part of the country, Toronto will also have rain and 10. Ottawa will be mainly sunny but cooler at only 5 degrees. Montreal will be partly cloudy and 6. Fredericton, New Brunswick will be mainly sunny and 3 degrees tomorrow. Halifax, Nova Scotia will have light flurries and 3 as well. Charlottetown, PEI will have light snow and 3. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect rain and a high near 8 degrees for tomorrow. The markets are up considerably today compared to how poorly they fared yesterday. North American markets fell hard on Wednesday. Canada's main index posted its worst day in more than 3 years. The TSX tumbled 376 points. In New York, the Dow dropped 608 points, or 2.4%, and the tech-heavy NASDAQ fell 822 points. The markets rebounded nicely today. We'll have the complete market numbers along with the commodity prices coming up later in business news. Farm Credit Canada says it will do what it can to help grain farmers in the prairies who are dealing with soggy crops. Parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan are still drying out from too much rain and some snow. The conditions delayed harvest and reduced crop quality. The FCC says it will offer flexible terms to its customers as they deal with the challenge on a case-by-case basis. Agriculture Minister Lawrence MacAulay says the FCC will consider deferral of principal payments and other loan payments to reduce the financial pressure on producers. The Environmental Working Group is reporting that there are unsafe levels of pesticide glyphosate in many cereals. They tested 28 breakfast cereals, including Cheerios and Quaker Oats. They found all 28 contained glyphosate, and 26 included more than what the group considered safe. They do not give a specific protocol for their testing and were vague in the link to describe their methods. They have set their safe level well below that of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Canada Post employees continued with rotating walkouts today in Calgary, Kelowna, and in Sherbrooke, Quebec. The strike in the Toronto area was after 2 days of stoppage, which affected the shipment of tens of thousands of letters and parcels nationwide. The Calgary walkout began last night, as did the one in Kelowna. Federal Labor Minister Patty Hajdu appointed a special mediator to help the two parties resolve their contract differences. Canfor says its net profit doubled to $125 million in the third quarter despite lower lumber prices. The Vancouver-based lumber company says it earned 98 cents per diluted share for the period ending December 30th, compared with 51 cents a year earlier. Canfor paid close to $47 million in countervailing and anti-dumping duties, up from $32 million in the third quarter of 2017. Adjusted earnings surged to $157 million, or $1.23 a share. Sales at Canfor increased 16% to about $1.3 billion. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, Alberta's Environment Minister Shannon Phillips was in Ottawa yesterday, urging senators not to pass Bill C-69 in its current form, since it could potentially hurt Alberta's energy sector. After meeting with close to 50 senators, Phillips says the bill shouldn't pass without changes being made. The bill would create a new impact assessment agency and would replace the National Energy Board with the Canadian Energy Regulator. Phillips says more clarity is still needed with the bill. When you see news happening, drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of today's top stories, check out our full newscast online at bridgecitynews.ca. Up next, a fascinating interview with someone who not only believes in miracles, but raising people from the dead. Hear what Dr. Randy Clark, the founder of Global Awakening, has to say next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. The Rangeland Collectors Club is holding its annual fall sale October 27th and 28th at the Rocky Mountain Turf Club beginning at 10 a.m. Discover interesting antiques and collectibles with vendors from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC. Admission is $3 and proceeds will go toward the Chinook Regional Hospital's Children's Ward and Woods Homes Youth Organization. The Nigerian-Canadian Association of Lethbridge and the Sobo Yijo Turning Point Foundation is presenting a symposium on global migration and Canadian immigration on Saturday, October 27th at the Main Public Library, downtown Lethbridge from 2 to 5 p.m. Hear from top experts about the challenges and opportunities immigration presents to our communities and country. Admission is free and all are welcome. The Gem of the West Museum Society in Coaldale is holding its annual Craft and Hobby Show on Saturday, November 3rd from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Admission is by donation. Come and see unique pieces from local artists, crafters, and vendors. For more information, contact Myrna at 403-345-4521 or email mlmo@shaw.ca. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Do you still believe that God heals people in today's modern world of science and reason? Today's guest says yes. Dr. Randy Clark is the founder of Global Awakening, a teaching and healing ministry that crosses denominational lines. He's also author of Eyewitness to Miracles. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Doctor.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Hal.
Now, have you experienced and witnessed a lot of miraculous healings?
Yes, I have. A lot.
Tell me about some of those healings that you saw.
In Canada, in Oshawa, we had a woman get healed of schizophrenia. In Tucson, Arizona, I had another woman get healed of schizophrenia. In Louisville, Kentucky, we had a man get healed of ALS. We had several people that's been healed of MS, 4 or 5 people healed of Parkinson's in California, and in Texas, Houston, Texas, 2 in one night, and also in Kentucky. We've seen over 5,000, about 5,500 people healed who had metal in their body with chronic pain and loss of range of motion. That's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. We've seen people born deaf healed, a man whose optic nerve was not connected to the back of his eye get healed. Those are in the book, I believe. Actually, the video itself. So when I say eyewitness to or watching the gospel come to life, I put in footnotes that have links that if you go to the link, it'll actually show you the very testimony I'm writing about, the person giving it right after it happened. And the guy about the eye, it was like a year or so later, testifying that the healing was still there. Actually, he moved his whole family, over 1,000 miles, to go to the church where he got healed at.
And you've also seen what, blind people healed as well?
Yes. Yes.
Wow. Now, how would you define exactly for our viewers what a miracle is?
Well, I don't use the scientific or the philosophical the interpretation of miracle because I think it's not biblical. It's too narrow to just our age of science. I see in the New Testament and the Old Testament that when God answers prayer, it's more about timing. For example, if you had been taking chemotherapy and it's not worked, you're getting worse, everything looks worse, the markers are worse and everything, and you get prayer, and then the next day you don't have cancer or the tumor disappears right then, science would say that, or at least the philosophical thinking would say, well, you can't prove that's a miracle. It could have been a delayed response to the chemotherapy. The fact that it happened suddenly, instantly, and right after the time of prayer, to me, makes it miraculous, even though it may not qualify by the technical term. I don't see why we have to be bound by those technical scientific terms, especially if they're not biblical.
So what percentage of people do you feel believe in miracles and healings today? I would guess that maybe it's less likely people believe in today's generation compared to 100 years ago. Perhaps our Western mindset doesn't allow for the supernatural. What are your thoughts?
It's the opposite. It's the opposite. There's more people that believe in the miraculous today than there was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we were still in modernity. We were still in this time of rationalism and reason and the denial of the supernatural. We're now living in post-modernity, which is much more open to the supernatural. You think of the TV shows. You've got all these lines of communication or storylines that deals with the supernatural. So there really is, in today, more openness to the supernatural. And there's also more evidence. At the time that David Hume wrote his works in the 1700s, he could actually say there's no one, hardly anybody believes in miracles. Almost no Christians have seen them. Well, that's not true today. There's so much evidence of miracles in the testimonies of what's happening today that it would have been true 200 years ago, say there's almost no Christians believe in healing. So it's actually different. And there's been a Pew Foundation study that talks about the high percentage of even doctors who believe that they have seen a miracle in response to prayer. So we're actually in a better position today as far as the people believing in miracles than it was 200 years ago.
I've experienced miraculous healing myself for my body and for other members of my family too. I've seen it firsthand. Now, if someone was to actually witness a real miracle, would we tend sometimes to explain it away somehow to science? Or maybe this is just the way the body does to heal itself? Human reasoning.
I have this kind of, to me, it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke, the scientific definition of miracle. It's spontaneous remission. It's the diagnosis was incorrect. There must be something wrong with the diagnosis. We actually had a doctor required the nurse to have 3 different x-rays of this healing that took place. He said, I'm a man of science, this is impossible. Until he said the x-ray is wrong x-ray. Then he said the x-ray machine's broken, use another one. And then finally after that, he asked the woman what had happened. She told him about this woman we prayed for, got an impartation for healing. She had prayed for her that night. It was like an hour afterwards. And he said, could you get your friend to come pray for me? So he went from the skeptical scientist, once he saw the evidence, to say, could you get her to pray for me?
Now, what about raising people from the dead? Does that actually happen today? I know it happened in the Bible.
Yes, it does. My friends who we prayed for in Canada, who got a strong impartation, anointing, they have seen hundreds, over 400 reports of dead being raised in their movement. And I have been and interviewed some of those people. Because one of my things is I like to do interviews with people who have raised the dead or the people who were raised from the dead. Been in a village, and a lot of them were in Muslim villages that caused the whole village to come to Jesus when they saw the dead raising.
That's incredible. Now, many people would say, hold on, Randy, can you actually prove or verify any of these miracles?
I asked Johnny about that, who's one of the leaders in Mozambique. I said, Johnny, I'm from America, and we're really skeptics, and I believe you, but my Americans are going to say, because we're pretty skeptical, how do you know they're really dead since there was no doctor there, since this is way out in the bush where there weren't any hospitals close by or even any type of medical facilities? How do you know they're dead? And he said, well, there's no pulse. We can't feel any breath. Their eyes glaze over, and then they get cold, and then they get stiff. And I said, Johnny, I think even for skeptical Americans, we would believe that that's dead.
Now, you actually did a study on the effects of Christian prayer on pain and mobility restrictions. Can you give me a bit of an overview of the study, including some of the results?
Well, I can guess at some of the results right now because I don't have the book in front of me, but I think the overall result was around 39% of the people who had the condition where they'd had surgery and metal put in that had caused them to be in chronic pain or a significant loss of function. They had to be at least 80% better before we included them in the study. I did studies on failed back surgery, and they said if you have that, if you have another surgery, if you get 10% better, that's good. 20% better is great. We didn't even include those, only 80% or more. We studied over 900 people, over about 450 of them would have qualified because they did not have successful surgeries, ending up with significant loss of motion or chronic pain. Right at 38% overall in the whole study had healings of 80% or more, which is unheard of in the science, actually, of failed back surgery. Now, it just wasn't failed back surgery. It's anything dealing with metal or another artificial material placed in the body that resulted in chronic pain. And then there was a quantitative study of over 900. The qualitative study of around 9 or 10 talked about what they could do, what they couldn't do, and it was much more in-depth interviews. I was actually studying were there variables. I had 6 variables that could increase the probability of healing happening. And if so, what are they? And I had this test I wanted to prove. Would these 6 variables prove to be the likelihood you have more probability of being healed? 3 of them did prove I was correct. A good theology for healing. knowing someone who's been healed personally or having been healed prior yourself, it's easier to be healed a second time. Two of the variables did not prove because of what's called a construct failure. The way I set up the test, it had a failure, internal contradiction in it. For example, I'd said that commanding prayers work better than intercessory prayers, but all the prayers were commanding prayers, so I couldn't test for that. Words of knowledge, except this is the one thing I don't have words of knowledge where I just have faith to go for this without words of knowledge. So it didn't include words of knowledge, so I couldn't study for that. But I do know, based upon just generally speaking, 25 years of praying for the sick, words of knowledge are very important in increasing faith for healing in people.
Now, in light of all of the serial attacks, serial killings, the shootings in the United States, let's talk a bit about mental illness. I mean, you mentioned schizophrenia, but have you also seen people being healed of other mental illnesses, including anxiety and depression?
Yes, yes. Just recently in Brazil, a woman had been depressed, I think, for 9 years, and the joy of the Lord came on her, and she was just laughing, and the depression was broken. We've seen quite a bit of depression broken through prayer. So yes, the answer is yes. Short answer is yes.
Now, you believe that God, by his very nature, always wants to heal people. After all, he's a loving, caring God. But reality is, not everyone you pray for gets healed, at least not healed in the physical sense here on earth. Sometimes they're healed and they're taken home to heaven. Is there an easy answer as to why they're not healed here and they remain with us another 10, 20, or 30 years?
No, I don't think there's an easy answer. And anytime I get a pad answer, I don't trust the people giving it to me. It's a mystery. I see people that I think they're going to get healed and they're not. I pray for people, this person's not going to be healed, and they get healed. Everything that makes sense, for example, like I don't believe the kinds of healings we're talking about are placebo effect, because the conditions necessary for placebo effect are often just not present. And actually, sometimes it's the opposite of what would need to happen for placebo. And placebo, that's one of the reasons why we tested the people we prayed for in this metal healing. Immediately afterwards, they had to be able to do something they could, and their praying had to go down at least 80%. Then we checked back with them 10 days later, and then we checked back with them at least 100 days later, because placebo effect doesn't last that long. And I talked to my doctor. The sense of heat and energy that happens from people a lot of the times when they're healed, there's nothing about that in the studies of placebo. I don't know the answers to why some people get healed and others don't. I know some things that contribute to an atmosphere where more get healed. But I'm not going to say it's what I tell my teams that I teach all over the world. Do not blame somebody if they don't get healed. Do not blame them and tell them it's because they didn't have enough faith. And don't tell them it's because they must have some unforgiven sin in their life. Don't do that.
Now, you write that 50% of people receiving healing actually feel some sort of physical sensation before the healing, but others really don't feel anything at all. Or there may be nothing's really manifest itself into healing until maybe days later after they've been prayed for. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yes, first of all, it's at least 50%. That's actually probably a low point, a lower figure than what it actually is. Secondly, some people get healed and they don't feel anything, and they get healed the moment they try to do what they can't. That's when they get healed. And then some people, they're not healed until days later. One of the most significant, a guy was 5 years old, and he spilled muriatic acid in his eyes, and it burned away his pupils and corneas, and all he has is like an eighth of an inch thick scar tissue in his eyes. He's like 60 years old, 55 years, studied and once lived in the same cities. All of his records are there. A woman on our team, wasn't me, she prayed for him for 5 hours. And every time she would stop, because nothing was happening. He didn't feel anything. There's no improvement. All the things that we train to look for, and especially if there's a lot of people there, you need to pray for as many people as you can. But every time she started to stop, she felt like she said, she'd hear this impression, don't stop. She left, he wasn't a bit better. 3 days later, he woke up with brand new eyes, and it was not a gradual healing. The pastor called me, it's a 30,000 member church. The pastor called me, it's the biggest miracle in the history of the city.
Now, what would you say to someone watching our show right now who does not have a relationship with God, with Jesus, doesn't even believe in God, but desperately needs a miracle in their life. What would you say to them, and what should they do?
Well, I would say to them that you could be healed anyway, and God uses healing sometimes as evangelistically. We saw one night in India, out of 100,000 people we preached to, 50,000 get healed, and then 30,000 accepted Jesus. So I believe you could be healed. We see healing often used to bring people to Jesus, and so when I'm with the poor and with the lost, particularly the poor and the lost together, I have even a higher expectation for healing to come. And it's the opposite of placebo effect because it's not their expectation.
Dr. Randy Clark, founder of Global Awakening and author of Eyewitness to Miracles. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Hal.
This week is Mental Illness Awareness Week. Joining me now via Skype from Ottawa is Chris Somerville, co-chair of the Canadian Alliance on Mental Illness and Mental Health. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you, Hal.
Now, how much of an issue is mental illness? Can you talk about how many Canadians really struggle with this?
Well, it is a big issue, as many Canadians know, because approximately 1 in 5 people today experience a significant mental health problem or mental illness. In fact, by the age of 40, about 50% of the population has had or has a mental illness. And that's a figure that really surprises people, that nearly half of Canadians will have or have experienced a mental illness. And the cost to the economy is $51 billion. So it's a big issue, and one that we continue to address with a lot of great passion.
So how would you define mental illness? What qualifies? Because I think a lot of us probably don't understand how many different kinds of mental illnesses there really are.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and list off all of the different mental illnesses, but there are a lot of them that psychiatrists and psychologists need to distinguish, Hal, between mental distress and mental stress. And then the greater that becomes in terms of affecting your thinking and your cognitive abilities, the greater that becomes, then it creates disorder in your life. I like to say that it interrupts your living, your learning, and your loving, and your playing. And that's why psychiatrists use the phrase a mental disorder, because at that intensity, it brings a great amount of disorder in your life, can interrupt your education, also having to take absence from the workplace. So mental illnesses need great care and great attention, but we have effective treatments for mental illness, and recovery is possible.
Now, most of us have had days when we're feeling blue or down, especially in the winter months when you rarely see the sunshine. But how would someone recognize when the symptoms of depression have crossed over the line and become a mental health issue?
Yeah, part of life is dealing with anxiety and depression. But when that anxiety or depression, or if you're experiencing hallucinations or delusions, you know that you need to be giving attention and self-care when it changes your personality. Friends around you, your parents, for example, may see a sudden change in your personality. Maybe you're not sleeping as well or eating as well, and it begins to interfere with your thinking and your actions and your motivation. And then that disorder comes about in terms of creating some chaos to some degree in your life. And it's at that point that a person needs to seek help. And the good news is, the earlier you go for help, the less likely that it will turn into a significant or lifelong mental illness like schizophrenia.
Are people quite hesitant to actually go for help?
Yes, they're very hesitant. Even though we've made progress about talking about mental health and mental illness, there's still that strong prevalence of stigma, which is, in fact, the number one reason why people are hesitant or don't go and get help. They don't want people to think that they're crazy, a nut bar, or that there's someone like a high-profile individual that has come in conflict with the law that has a mental illness, even though 97% of people with a mental illness never come in conflict with the law or or act out in violence.
Now, there's always been a bit of a stigma surrounding mental illness. Can you explain to our viewers what stigma is, what that stigma specifically is, and how can we go about changing it?
Well, stigma is based on prejudice, and we all have some degree of prejudice. So whether it's racism, sexism, ageism, or mentalism, as we call it, stigma has to do that you have a preconceived bias against an individual based on your upbringing, your education, your lack of contact with people with a mental illness. And that social prejudice then is combined with fear and apprehension. And then you bring in or add to that all the mythologies and misunderstandings about mental illness that, people will be violent or they can't recover or there's no treatment. Or their parents cause the mental illness, so forth. And so you move from that social prejudice, bias, to stigma, as we call it. And stigma, that's an attitude. Stigma is an attitude, but it always moves into an action, and that action is what we call discrimination. So we're not wanting to just end stigma, we want to end the discrimination.
Of course, it seems that the mainstream media plays a major role in reinforcing stereotypes we have when it comes to mental illness. Are there certain groups specifically engaging media outlets to change how individuals with mental illnesses are portrayed?
Well, that's a great question, because a lot of people do form their understanding or concept of a mental illness based on movies, horror movies, sitcoms. For example, if a character in a movie is portrayed as having a mental illness, about 60 to 75% of the time they're portrayed as also being violent. Now, in terms of media, the Mental Health Commission of Canada journalists like Andre Picard have been addressing journalist students in terms of how to report on mental illness and suicide, and always have those disclaimers that, for example, what I said a moment ago when I was speaking about violence, I put out a disclaimer that 97% of people living with a mental illness are not violent. And also interviewing a person with lived experience of a mental illness. Oftentimes media simply reports the facts, but they don't interview a service provider, or like a psychologist, or actually interview a person living with bipolar disorder, and they themselves explaining the nature of the illness and how they are living in a life of a recovery. I do mention the word recovery several times, Hal, and that means living beyond the limitations of a mental illness with a sense of purpose and hope and social inclusion as you learn to manage the illness and get on with life and hopefully have a quality of life.
Now, when you talk about the fact that a lot of people with mental illness, they generally are not violent, would that include violence against themselves or hurting themselves?
Right. I mean, people experience violence. People with mental illness are not so much the perpetrators as they are the victims of violence themselves. That is very high, especially with women who experience a mental illness. The rates of violence towards them is much higher than the general population.
Is there less of a stigma today than there was maybe a decade ago?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because there are some illnesses that have become more destigmatized. For example, like anxiety disorders and depression. When you look at schizophrenia or psychosis, there's still a heavy layer of stigma. But overall, we've made progress. Employers addressing it in terms of psychological health and safety in the workplace. Politicians, some of our political leaders talking about their lived experience or family members. So there is a greater conversation and a greater openness about it than before the commission was created 11 years ago.
Now, one of the issues with mental illness is having proper access to health care. And I understand that can sometimes be a challenge, especially in rural Canada.
Well, yes, it's a huge issue in urban areas as well. People can be waiting from 6 to 12 months to access a service provider. Now, not everyone needs a psychiatrist. It may be a psychologist, it may be a peer support worker. But the more rural you go and the more northern you go, then the harder it is to receive mental health supports and services. The access is greater. So people can be spending over a year, and in some places they have to fly into a major urban area to receive the treatment that's available. And unfortunately, the stigma is also greater. The more rural, the more northern that you go.
Now, healthcare budgets across the country are pretty tight right now. There are a lot of money that goes towards battling heart disease and cancer. Now, do you believe our government needs to invest more money into research and care into the mental illness category?
Well, the short answer is yes. And although the current government in their first year did allocate $777 million over a 10-year period, that's just a drop in the bucket. The Mental Health Commission in its work has called for us to move from an average nationally of 7% investment in mental health to 9%, and how some countries are at 12%. So we're still way behind, and we are calling on the federal government to increase spending for mental health and designated for mental health, and that would be approximately about 25% of the federal government's contribution to mental health, to bring it up to 9%, which would improve access to treatment services and also community supports and services as well.
Now, you mentioned some countries invest about 12% of their budget into mental health programs, helping those with those issues. Which countries specifically, and what can we learn from them?
Well, Australia and Scotland, and they have been very progressive, and in England. And in some of those countries, including the United States, they have what's called a Mental Health Parity Act. And so the Canadian Alliance on Mental Illness and Mental Health this week has been asking members of Parliament and senators to consider, more than consider, passing a Mental Health Parity Act, which means that you put mental health on the same playing field. You value mental health as equally to physical health. And so all the services that are provided for people who have cardiovascular problems or metabolic diabetes, et cetera, that same level of focus and intensity and allowing for funding to obtain those services is equal to physical health. So that's parity. In England, they call it parity of esteem. Mental health has low esteem. We want that esteem to go higher.
So what does the road to recovery actually look like for someone struggling with mental illness?
Well, it's very individual. Recovery is based on the concept of hope and looking at the strengths that people have. It's seeing a person, not a illness. A diagnosis is just a label, not your identity. So it can include introducing the patient, if they're in a hospital, to a peer support worker who has lived experience of mental illness, but also has gone on to experience a quality of life or life satisfaction. So service providers then need to engage in their work from what we call a recovery orientation or focus. And that means that people can regain life satisfaction and quality of life. But in order for that to happen, it means that primary care has to be connected to mental health care and also to social care, because relapse prevention is as much about providing the community supports and services as it is medication. And so it's a different approach from what we've historically said. I mean, once upon a time, a diagnosis of schizophrenia was called the kiss of death diagnosis. So we know much more today about how to help people, how to help them to manage the illness, have a better quality of life, but it takes a supporting, caring community, it takes a supporting family, employers, and also addressing the social determinants, the aspects, unresolved trauma issues, lack of housing, things that add stress. I mean, we don't know what causes a mental illness, but we certainly know what triggers every mental health condition, issue, or illness, and that's stress. So if you don't have adequate housing, if you don't have employment, that can lead at least to mental distress, if not to a mental illness.
So how are our schools handling mental health issues for students, whether it's in an elementary school classroom or even at the college or university level?
Well, the awareness has grown significantly. How? I hear educators, principals, guidance counselors, and school teachers as I travel across Canada they themselves talking about their concern for their students as students are presenting with more mental health issues or conditions. And so different associations, for example, Association of Principals, guidance counselors, are looking at provincial governments and working with provincial governments in terms of the mental health branch or department about developing curriculum. And how do you talk to a 10-year-old about mental health? Well, I encourage, even as we have discussions about dental health with kids, why can't we have that same relaxed, safe conversation about mental health and mental health education, so that people don't feel that it's abnormal or that stigma, that uncomfortableness, that there's something wrong in my mind, my thinking. Elementary students, for example, don't necessarily have to have a word for it, but if they're saying that they feel sad and they're having difficulty sleeping, or they feel bullied, or there's a change in the behavior of the child, certainly something's going on, and that person needs great care and attention.
We only have a few short moments left here, Chris, but quickly I wanted to ask you, we were talking off camera about this, I want you to share with our viewers your right hand and how you actually lost your right hand. Interesting story.
Well, I grew up in Alabama. I was born there in 1952, came to Canada in 1985, and we would go to Louisiana and alligator hunt. And so when I was 17, putting the rope on the alligator, I didn't do it right, and my hand was bit, and the doctors were not able to save it. And so I've had a prosthesis, a hook, as we call it, since that time. So yeah, alligator hunting, that's how I lost my
Alligator
right.
hunting accident, wow. How cool is that? That's amazing. Chris Somerville, co-chair of the Canadian Alliance on Mental Illness and Mental Health. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Have a great night.